we are willing to change the conversation about Africa. Firstly, to speak to the issue of redressing historical justice and legitimacy, we need a permanent seat. Secondly, framing the conversation on African issues. We need African agency and we need African solutions. But we cannot achieve both if we're not able to set the agenda and framing the conversation in the council. We hope that is continued because I think that's one big legacy which we hope we are leaving, and this includes the continuing strengthening of the A3+ mechanism in the council. There was an agreement. There was a commitment by the parties to neutralize the FDLR and for the disengagement of forces, which essentially withdrawal of forces. There was an agreement on ceasefire. There was an agreement for an ad hoc verification mechanism to be brought in to monitor the ceasefire. And we had a broad framework of a peace agreement. Now, eventually, the summit was not successful because one of the parties withdrew. Frustrating, but those really form the main thrust of the agreement that was signed in Washington. So I will still call that successful. The efforts of President Lorenzo and the efforts of former President Uhuru Kenyatta were quite valuable. So I would not immediately dismiss the African effort because there was, of course, a clear African solution for such an African challenge.
You know, it is an African conflict, and African member states at the UN and in the Security Council have long advocated for continental leadership for issues on the continent. But unfortunately, for the worst conflict on the continent right now, we just haven't seen that leadership politically. So it's not exclusively a one-for-one and being able to have one actor, whether African or otherwise, lead these efforts on their own. There needs to be a really fluid and integrated mix of who has access, opportunities, influence with different parties at different times. And you know, that also includes the UN, where you have the large peacekeeping mission, MONUSCO, on the ground in the eastern DRC. And even though they weren't leading the peace process and aren't brokering a ceasefire, they're going to be expected to play a big role in actually seeing through its implementation.
And so the draft resolution on Sudan that was dealing with protection of civilians really was a victim of those geopolitical tensions. And we saw that openly in the discussions. So I don't think it's about consulting on Sudan at the time, and where Sudan is now at the moment is different from where when the resolution was tabled. Now, of course, the situation has changed. The SAF has returned and taken over Khartoum. We have a civilian administration, and we've been saying that that civilian administration must be supported to go through the process that eventually will lead to elections and return to democracy.
And it's been nearly a year since that last text was put to a vote. Council members have issued some press statements about deteriorating humanitarian situations, but listening to colleagues and CSOs and leaders from Sudan who have been advocating for far greater international action to halt the war's atrocities really over the past 2 years, it's unfortunate that the council has been unable to really overcome these political divides.
We've shown that we can be very effective, united, to speak, not only on African files, as I've really elaborated, from the DRC to Sudan and other situations, we negotiate together, but also on other files. So we've demonstrated, particularly on the issue of reform, that a permanent African seat can be an effective addition that adds legitimacy and robustness to the council. Because the A3+, we've demonstrated that in the past 2 years. And for us as Sierra Leone, we've prioritized A3+ unity. So it has been an excellent vehicle for us to convey African issues.
I mean, I think every council member has to be ambitious in terms of what they come to the Security Council hoping to achieve. Otherwise, they'll fall far below even realistic expectations of what they want to deliver. I don't necessarily think that even Sierra Leone thought it would get a final agreement among all P5 countries on what a reformed council would look like when it took on this ambition to have this conversation. But it did change the tone of the conversation. It did move countries' statements forward, which, unfortunately in multilateral settings, that is, there needs to be a long game played. And I think Sierra Leone understood that.
There have been calls for greater transparency, more engagement and information on that. So the resolution that was adopted on revitalization really spells all of those things out. Try to do the process early, so we get this letter out that will lead to the nomination of candidate as early as possible. So it will then fall on Sierra Leone, and we have time to engage on this, and we'll try to be as constructive as possible to move the process forward. But in the engagement, of course, as an African member state, we have our own priorities, including ensuring that we strengthen what we have, particularly in terms of the UN's engagement with the African Union. There are calls for the first female Secretary General. So all of those things that are there. What we want to do is to have a process that will allow for member states to be able to put forward those views, and that will lead to the election of a Secretary General, in which we will focus on the vision and not the process.